Okay, so where was I? All right, so obviously, the documentary, I think, kind of interesting. A lot of people who actually worked on the development of the modern social media platforms that a lot of us use every day, and kind of waving the flag about how alarming it is. And I think, and something I'll underline, as we go through, is that today, we talk about social media, but in a lot of ways, what social media really is not really social media anymore. They're attention farms, right? They're platforms that are there ultimately to control us, right? To draw our attention and keep our attention on things as long as possible, because that's where the money comes from. I think that's what that documentary is kind of about, right? It's the way that social media has become about holding your attention, about turning you into a product, about selling you in microtransactions, in a sense, to advertisers, people who want to profit off you, people who want your attention, want you to buy things, and they're really, really good. I have a friend, lovely person, but just in having a conversation with her, she spends a lot of time on Instagram, and she said, she was always being sold products by Instagram that she ended up really, really wanting. And they were over for Christmas, not this year, but last year, and her family. And she had bought like this, basically like an online scavenger hunt for kids, right? And she's like, yeah, it was recommended to me by Instagram. And she's like, yeah, Instagram really, really knows me really well. And it's always putting forward things that I really want. And, during COVID, we had done these online escape rooms with them, right? All kind of funneled to her by Instagram because it knew kind of what she was looking for. All right, so I got my question slides all set up for you to start asking questions. Oh, yes, I will do that. Sorry, totally forgot. I will do that for certain. I thought I had. Maybe I didn't. I will make sure I do it before I leave today. Okay. So this isn't on your slides that you download. I just added this because I was just kind of thinking about this as the kind of closing of the documentary was going. So this is a part of the introduction from a book by Neil Postman. It's called Amusing Ourselves to Death. And I think I haven't quite decided. It's a very, very famous book. I haven't quite decided what my reading list is going to be for my class in the fall, which is Critical Media Studies. But I'm starting to think that, yeah, I might put Amusing Ourselves to Death on the list because it's really kind of an interesting book, in a lot of ways really prescient. And Postman starts the introduction by juxtaposing, two visions of the world. And I kind of alluded to this when we talked about, Ryan Burge and his views on what's going on with sex. He references this book, and it's a really famous book. But what he says here is he contrasts two kind of dystopias, right? Let me highlight them for you. Two dystopias, essentially from the 20th century. The first one, obviously, is Orwell's 1984, right? So that's Orwell, and that's very famously 1984. And the second one is a book called Brave New World, which far fewer people have read, but everybody should. That was published by Aldous Huxley, right? It was another, another kind of dystopian writer from the 20th century, looking at, what the future might look like in terms of how people are controlled. And, what's this? Huxley feared we would become a trivial cult. So Orwell feared we'd become a captive culture, right? We all know 1984, right? Big Brother controls everything, sees everything. That's been the model of authoritarianism. But for Postman, I think this is where social media maybe comes in, that we become a trivial culture, preoccupied with some equivalent of the feelies, right? These are things from the book, the orgy-porgy, or the centrifugal bumble puppy, but you could easily put in, TikTok. You could take those out and swap that for TikTok, Instagram, Twitter X, Facebook, or whatever you like, right? And I think the kind of thing, what's it at the end here? In 1984, sorry, where's the... In short, Orwell feared that what we hate will ruin us. Huxley feared that what we love will ruin us, right? And for Postman, the book Amusing Ourselves to Death, how did I trigger Google Assistant? Quiet you. Maybe my Roomba is working finally. So right, Orwell feared that what we hate will ruin us. Huxley feared what we love will ruin us. And the book Amusing Ourselves to Death, which, again, really interesting book. It's about TV, but I think the idea in it kind of applies to social media as well. Thinking that Huxley, not Orwell, was the one who was right? Not that we'd be controlled by, a totalitarian state, but, we wouldn't need to be controlled by a totalitarian state, right? Orwell feared were those who would ban books. Huxley feared there would be no one to ban a book, or no need to ban a book, but there would be no one who wanted to read one. And I mean, hey, if you want to look at some depressing numbers, look at the number of books that are being read by Gen Z, or the SAT scores for reading and writing for Gen Z. They're very low, and it's very, very problematic. Why? Because attention is an economy, and TikTok is more exciting than books, right? Okay. So I know this is a weird way to start, but I do want to kind of jump in. All right, so Haidt's book. I'm going to go back to the cover for half a second. The Anxious Generation, right? So in a lot of ways, what I used to have in this slot in this course was Jean Twenge's book, iGen, which I talked about a little bit at the beginning of the course. And iGen, really is about Gen Z, the ways that the Gen Z is kind of different from other generations. And specifically, a big part of iGen was about the decline in mental health that we see in Gen Z, for Twenge. Oops, that's the highlighter. Don't want add to my pen, right? So this iGen was her book. 2017 is when she wrote it, which amazingly, when I was lecturing on it last semester, I'm like, man, 2017 was 7 years ago. And it felt very current to me at the time, but now, it does feel a little bit dated. So, in iGen, Twenge talks a lot about this decline in mental health amongst Gen Z, how they're different, things like spending less time with friends. And this is kind of where I think Jonathan Haidt's book, which, by the way, just in case you're wondering how current this is, this book came out in March 2024. So this is like hot off the presses almost. I was honestly lecturing on it last semester, like a couple weeks after it came out. I hadn't exactly finished the book at that time. So, I was kind of working with it as I read through it. It's a really interesting book. But I think Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, which again is all about, the anxious generation is Gen Z. And I should say, Twenge and Jonathan are friends. Jean Twenge and Jonathan Haidt are friends. But yeah, it's all about Gen Z and this change in mental health. And Haidt, along with Twenge and lots of other people, are putting really a lot of the blame on on this this confluence of two things, right? Smartphones and social media, right? The two of those things together, right? Because, like Haidt will say a bit later in the book, and I'll talk about it, and when we talk about the heavy users of social media, right? Most of whom are girls who are spending, in excess of 40 hours a week on social media. Haidt will say, when it was just on a computer, right? When social media was just on a computer, and people typically had, a family computer or maybe a laptop, it was virtually impossible to spend 40 hours a week on, no, pen, go down. And now it's like under the foot of the desk. Oh dear. And it's magnetic, so it's stuck to it. Okay. That it was basically impossible to spend 40 hours a week when you had to sit down at a computer, especially if, a lot of families didn't have laptops, and spend, 40, and it was plugged into the wall, right? To spend that much time on social media. Smartphones are what ultimately enable the amount of time we spend and the pervasiveness of the technologies, right? So either of these technologies alone might not cause what Haidt sees as really the central harms to young people that social media and smartphones together are causing. But because these technologies exist, at the same time, and then you had things like in the 2000s, you had the kind of the invention and the popularization of Wi-Fi, which made everything more pervasive. With all of these things together, you get a huge change in mental health. And, as I think we kind of saw at the beginning of the course, and we saw, in the lectures on youth and mental health last time, right? The decline has been this kind of inverted hockey stick or a hockey stick shaped graph where, poor mental health kind of rises really quickly after about 2008, 2010, right? And if, just to remind you, the iPhone is introduced in 2007 at Apple World. So, that's when Steve Jobs, does his one more thing. They introduced the iPhone. Takes a couple of years for it to really get critical mass. But once it does, right, and then everybody starts copying it, right? You get Android, you get BlackBerry changing things up, you get Windows Phone. Oh, how I miss Windows Phone. I loved you so much. But you're gone. You failed. But you were so cool. And you have no idea what I'm talking about, but that's okay. I miss my Windows Phone. I still have a few of them kicking around in a drawer. Yeah. Windows Phone. It was a thing. They killed it in 2016. Nomura Patre Filia Spiritu Sancti. Oh yeah, it had a tile-based interface. It was very cool. Look it up. It was neat. I loved it. At the end of its life cycle, it had a, what was it called? Continuum, where you could plug the phone into a dock, and you had basically full Windows. And then they canceled it. They were like, hey, we have this cool technology, and no one wants to buy it. So goodbye. Ah, sad. Anyway. Now I'm too depressed to continue with the class. Goodbye. No, I'm kidding. All right. So the big change window, for Haidt is between 2010 and 2014. Maybe at the outside, 2015, right? Depends on kind of where you look. And this is a period that he'll come to call the Great Rewiring, right? And essentially, like, your brains were all being rewired during this point, and we've rewired childhood. Okay, and what kind of happens in this period, right? In 2011, roughly, a quarter of teens own smartphones. By 2016, right, it's 79%, and that percentage just keeps going up, right? That's already, almost a decade ago. So, why 2015? Why is 2015 kind of an important year? Okay, basically, by 2015, we could start to see some concerning numbers, right? So Common Sense Media, which is this nonprofit that kind of looks at a bunch of different things regarding media, found that, on average, teens spend about 2 hours a day on social media, right? So that's average. It means there's a lot of people spending more time than that on social media as well. Pew in 2015 found that a quarter of teens said they were online almost constantly. By 2022, almost 2 years ago, that number is doubled to 46%. So almost half of teenagers basically say they are online almost constantly. Okay, and this, Haidt suggests, and he's, well joined here by Sherry Turkle, right? I've talked about her before, and this book you should all read this summer, because you're all nerds like me who want to read about, youth and technology. But she wrote this book called Alone Together. Right, that people are, for those who are constantly online, and that's an increasing number of young people. And then there's a whole category of people who are online a lot of the time, and maybe not almost constantly, but often, right, and all down the ladder. While they're with people, sometimes their consciousness is elsewhere. So if you remember, right, when I was talking about loneliness last class and some of the springtide data, right, people feel like their relationships are superficial, or they feel alone even when they're with other people. This is kind of what Haidt is talking about, right? Phones and social media and all of those things have intruded into our lives in increasingly pervasive ways. Okay. Sorry, I love this image because I actually have never, I have young kids, so I don't go to restaurants that often, frankly, because it's not the most pleasant of experiences. But you see this a lot on YouTube or on Instagram, right? People who take pictures of their food, right? Whatever it is they're eating. My wife has a friend, one of her longest, closest friends, who her Instagram is pretty much just all pictures of her and taking pictures of all her food. And I'm like, do they ever eat at home? How do they have this much money? They have no children. That's how they have money. Okay, so Haidt thinks that there, a particular moment for the harmfulness of social media comes in 2010. Again, it's a confluence of technologies, right? There's a bunch of technologies that kind of go together to create a particular moment, and that's the moment that we're in that's really, really harmful in lots of ways, right? So I'll point out, right, the original iPhone. If you want to talk about the iPhone, it didn't have a camera. Camera, right? It didn't have a camera. It didn't get a rear-facing camera, I think, until its third kind of iteration, the iPhone 3GS, right? And then in 2010, they launch what's probably, I think, if you were to do a history of the iPhone and it's sort of where it hits critical mass, you would probably have to go to, bless you, the iPhone 4 as the one that really, while the iPhone was really popular, the iPhone 4 really launched everything into the stratosphere, right? It was the most refined version of the product up till that point. And it was really, whereas, the iPhone 3, or the iPhone 3G and the iPhone 3GS were good, the iPhone 4 really kicked the whole thing into high gear. And right, that was the first smartphone that I bought, was an iPhone 4. It's actually also the only iPhone I ever bought. Because after that, I switched to other platforms. And I've never gone back to the iPhone, and God willing, I never will. So I do have an iPad, but I still don't know what to do with it. If someone could tell me, what is this device for? I still don't understand the iPad. I'm like, big phone? Bad phone. Heavy phone. Sad phone. I don't know. Still don't get it. Okay, so 2010, the iPhone 4 launches and has a front-facing camera. It's a shitty front-facing camera, but it's a front-facing camera. And the same month, right, Samsung launches the Galaxy S, which obviously will become its kind of, I don't want to say, it's not quite as iconic as the iPhone, but it's, the second best selling smartphone model on the market for a really long time. And it's kind of a two-horse race from then on in lots of ways. Okay, and again, the ability to take selfies of yourself, right, to have that front-facing camera so it's easy to take a picture of your own face wouldn't itself necessarily be harmful. But for Haidt, what happens, Instagram launches the same year, right? So Instagram, which is, I think in lots of ways, the first, and I'll say image-based social media, right? Because what you had before then was really Facebook. You had MySpace. You had, I can't remember when Twitter launched, to be honest. But Instagram is sort of the model for image-based social media, right? Snapchat will follow shortly thereafter, but it's Instagram that really lays pictures as the central thing that you're doing on social media. Okay, now Instagram kind of, goes of years, right? Launches in 2010, and Facebook buys it in 2012, and basically pushes the platform, right, by using what people already have. Your Facebook account is now a shared account with Instagram. They push people to using Instagram, and basically, the user base goes from 10 million in 2012 to 90 million by early 2013, right? So they grow the company enormously, right? And the user base grows enormously, as does its popularity. Suddenly, with the backing of a mega corporation like Facebook, there is, all this ability to scale everything up on Instagram. And they bring the same kind of attention-based model that had been really successful on Facebook to Instagram. Okay, so selfie-based social media emerges basically in about 2012, when Instagram is bought by Facebook, and teen girls really lean into this type of social media, right? Instagram becomes sort of the girls' social media in lots of ways. I know guys use it as well, but it's dominated, and its biggest user base is girls and women. And boys engage with things like video games, YouTube, and we'll talk about especially video games and pornography a little bit later when we talk about how social media potentially harms boys. But yeah, I mean, basically boys engage with video games, YouTube, Reddit, and obviously hardcore pornography in major ways. Okay, so one of the things that Haidt is going to do in this book, and the book, I will say, the first half of the book is really on like setting out the problem. And actually, I will give, one of the things I really like about the book, and one of the things I will give Haidt a ton of credit for, is unlike, I'll tell you, I guess, how to put this. There's a lot of social commentary and social criticism, right? And this is really what the book is a form of social criticism that will lay out the problems in great detail and then give you one really short chapter being like, here's what we do about it. And actually, Haidt's book is way more balanced than this. I would say about half of it is here's the problem, and then half of it is here's what I think the solutions are. And I always think it's funny because, again, one of my, I don't know, not intellectual heroes, but somewhere where I kind of cut my teeth was on all of Neil Postman's books. And he wrote a book called Technopoly. It's a really long book. It goes through all of the problems of like a technocratic society. And then it has a 20-page chapter called The Loving Resistance Fighter, where he's sort of like, I'm really good at the social criticism. I have absolutely no fucking idea what to do about any of this. But, maybe smile and be kind to people. And Haidt actually, like, the book is really well balanced. And I'll talk a little bit about his suggestions next class in terms of, what he thinks we need to do. So the first half is really the problems. And then the second half, and that's what we're going to talk about today and at the beginning of class tomorrow. And then the back half is what he thinks we need to do about it. So, all right. So basically, one of the kind of things that he lays out in the book is essentially this concept that the way society used to be organized, right, and has been organized for humans for the longest time until just recently, is that basically childhood was what he called play-based, right? That in childhood and in adolescence, there was a lot of play, right? And that this fundamentally now has shifted, and what we've gone to is a phone-based childhood. I'll talk about that in a sec, and that this is a huge problem. Okay, so basically, he's a social psychologist, right? So Haidt, I think, does some interesting kind of stuff, blending psychology and sociology, which is always fun. There's a little bit of insight here from evolutionary biology, basically noting that, like all mammals, right? All mammal species, right? From your cat, when your cat was a kitten, when your dog was a puppy, play is really, really important to basically all mammals, right? Mammals will learn from, like if you ever see videos of like, I don't know, baby foxes, right? Baby foxes learn how to hunt by jumping on each other, jumping on, the things that their parents bring home for them, right? They play a lot to learn how to hunt, how to survive in the wild. Play is really, really important for a mammalian species. And, Haidt will go as far as to say that play is the work of childhood, right? That this is basically, and certainly, from, when we hit industrialization for sure, play becomes more and more important. There was still play though, even in those times where kids were working on the farm, they still played. Okay, so play is the work of childhood. If you stop mammals from playing, right, most mammal species will come out socially, cognitively, and emotionally impaired, right? So play is very important in proper brain and emotional development for basically all mammalian species. And it's about, amongst other things, learning how to navigate the environment, right? Learning critical skills, when, like I said, when talking about baby foxes, right? They jump around to practice pouncing and catching things. They jump on grasshoppers and bugs and their siblings and all of these things, right? Humans play a little bit differently, right? You do learn, some social hierarchy skills. There's a lot of navigating the social environment that happens in play, right? You learn how to exist as a human being, how to navigate social hierarchies, how to navigate conflict, how to deal with hurt feelings, hurt bodies, and all of these sorts of things, right? So, and he'll say, even joking, teasing, and gossiping, gives them lessons in nuanced nonverbal cues and that are key to social skills, right? So I have a 4-year-old. He's very cute. He's terrible at telling jokes. He really is. Like, he really wants to tell jokes, but and this is where being a sociologist kind of sucks sometimes, because it's like, I see what's happening and then I can relate it to all of these like socio-psychological processes. He tries to tell jokes, right? And he gets them wrong a lot of the time. But as he kind of goes through, right, he learns kind of what's funny, how to tell jokes, how to, get people to laugh, what kind of jokes don't work. And boy, when you're 4, a lot of your jokes really don't work because they don't make sense, because you're kind of learning to grasp the elements of humor, right? So he's what is it? The one that he really likes. Oh, there's 2 knock-knock jokes. There's the interrupting horse one, right? Where you try to say interrupting horse who, and then he like neighs at you in the middle. And it's a very stupid joke, but it's kind of funny when a 4-year-old tells it. And the one where knock, knock, who's there? Banana. And then he's knock, knock, and you say, who's there? Banana, banana, banana. And then he says orange, and you're like, orange who? Orange, you glad I didn't say banana? So he's finally mastered those 2. They're terrible jokes, but they're kind of funny when a 4-year-old tells them, right? But it's part of, and again, now I can think of this because the more you know, the more you just kind of understand what's happening from a social perspective. That play is learning about social cues, right? It's learning about language. It's learning about all of these sorts of things, right? So, as much as, and your mama might tell you don't gossip, you can tell your mom, but mom, gossiping gives me those key skills that I need to learn to navigate the social environment. I know we shouldn't gossip, but really, if I don't gossip, I'm losing out on some potentially very important social skills development that I should be having right now. Okay, right? So all of these things, right? It's play with language, play with, concepts, gossiping, joking around, teasing people. It's all kind of part of learning how to navigate, human existence, right? Okay. Now play with others in the real world, right? So I'm going to say this is all IRL, right? Not online. I know. It involves some degree of risk, right? So play with others, especially play with some degree of risk, teaches children how not to get hurt, right? Both physically, right, and socially, right? So, you're playing soccer, right? Or you learn how not to get hurt, right? You learn how to navigate those situations on the playground, right? Climbing trees, climbing high things, right? You learn how to do things safely in situations that are relatively low risk. Chances are, or riding your bike, I don't know if you're, so the prevalence of this has gone down, which is kind of sad. But I know when I was a kid, right, we would always try to build like ramps out of like a piece of, press board and some 2x4s or whatever, and try to ride your bike over it, right, to try and make a jump in the back alley or on the street by your house, right? It's a relatively low risk. You might fall and break an arm or sprain or break a wrist. The first bone I ever broke was my wrist, which was exactly doing that, trying to ride off of this thing, and the ramp sort of went sideways as I rode onto it because we didn't build it very well, and we just stacked boards. Didn't turn out very well. I fell, broke my wrist, right? But I learned to navigate kind of the physical environment in a relatively low risk environment, right? I hurt myself, wasn't that bad, the itching on my arm where it was casted was pretty terrible, but aside from that, not too terrible, right? So there are risks, but the risks aren't overly costly, right? And you see kids playing, right? They get into fights, they shove, they throw a few punches, right? It's relatively low stakes. Most things get sorted out relatively quickly, mostly by them, but sometimes with the help of adults, right? some kid storms off and he takes his basketball home because you were being mean to him, and then everybody learns, oh, if we're mean to Timmy, we don't get to play basketball because he was the only one with the basketball. All of this stuff happens in real life. Okay. Now, what Haidt will say is that all of this is very different from kind of how we live now. It's all embodied, synchronous, one-to-one or one-to-several, right? You exist basically in relationships with people that you know, right? In real time with your body in an actual place. Now, phone-based childhood, on the other hand, and that's the real distinction, we'll put this one in red because it's bad. No, it's not. Well, disembodied, asynchronous, and one-to-many, right? And think of like Fortnite or any online video game, right? Or social media, right? It's not embodied, right? It's not your actual body doing anything. It's it can be asynchronous. Social media especially is asynchronous, right? Because you're not reacting to things in real time all the time. And it's one-to-many, right? Okay. So, phone-based childhood. And here, I know you've seen this before, but it's kind of important. Oops, I went the wrong way. I want my pen. I want my pen back. Right, I know you've seen this chart before. This is time, meet up with friends daily, right? So basically, percentage, I guess it's different. We had time spent with friends daily, right? And back in 2003, that magical time, it was about 160 minutes a day, right? And then it had dropped by 2019 to about 60 minutes a day. Same kind of thing here, right? The percentage of students who meet up with friends daily, right, has been going down for a long time, right? Used to be, right around 60% for boys, a bit closer to 50% for girls, and it's dropped, closer into the kind of low 30s for both today, right, or by 2017. So this may have dropped even more, and certainly dropped more after, during COVID. Okay, so phone-based childhood. Broadly, phone-based childhood, right, is the childhood that a lot of us are giving our children today. It's maybe what a lot of you experienced. One in which, you had smartphones from a relatively early age, or some kind of screen was present, right? So, basically a lot of things moved onto the phone. So Haidt refers to phones and other screens, right? So this could include the iPad. I don't know what to do with. Certainly not giving it to my kids, though they really want me to. I keep telling them my work bought it for me, so you can't have it. That seems to be working for now. Okay, so he calls screens experience blockers, right? Because they stop you from having real world experiences. Now, they do that by opening new kinds of experiences, right? They have, social media, video games. You can farm your virtual farm, and I don't know if farm life is still a thing. I don't really care. It was for a while, right? It opens up a whole bunch of new experiences, chatting with people online, all of this kind of stuff. But basically what Haidt will say is attention and time, and this is obviously true, is this kind of a zero-sum thing, right? Every moment that you're spending on a screen is a moment that you're not spending in the real world, right? It's and basically for Haidt, that's the world that humans evolved to develop naturally in, was the physical world. And every moment that they're in the digital world is a moment they're not doing those things that we evolved to do, right? That human beings evolved basically to develop through. Okay, so he'll say this, and this is especially true for girls, right? Life online forces a couple of things, and it forces them at times that might be too early for young people. Very early, right? The second young people get social media, they immediately start to realize that they have to be brand managers, and very, very conscious ones, right? The internet culture has this permanence. We all know this, right? We've all seen cancel culture kind of in operation, right? Somebody, I don't know, I think it was Kevin Hart, he had been basically nominated to lead the Academy Awards, right, to be the host of the Academy Awards. And then people went digging through his Twitter and found something from a decade earlier where he made, I think it was a homophobic joke. I can't actually remember. And And basically, he got canceled, right? And this happens all the time. We've seen cases of it where, what was it? There was one, it was someone had gotten a scholarship, right? I think she was a young student. She was going to the University of Alabama. She had gotten a scholarship to be on the cheer team. And once she got the scholarship, one of her classmates surfaced, a comment from when she was like 13, where she used a racial epithet, right? Or a racial slur, and circulated this first amongst her classmates. And then it got back to University of Alabama. They canceled her scholarship and all of this sort of stuff, right? So people become very conscious that, anything they say online can be used against them. And then there's no statute of limitations and stuff never goes away. And this kind of forces people out of the moment, right? Rather than being in the moment, people might be forced to think ahead about social consequences and not do things for their own sake. The other thing it obviously does, right, is it makes life very performative in lots of ways. Oh, what is there's a saying, and I can't remember it right off the top of my head, but if something happens and you didn't put it on Instagram, did it actually happen? And I was reading an article about this, because this is the nerdy life I live, about, Instagram boyfriends and Instagram husbands who basically exist for the purpose of taking pictures of their girlfriends and wives as those girlfriends and wives have experiences, right? So it's like, no, you laugh, but honestly, this was a whole thing that I read about, and like the level of like life dissatisfaction that comes from this, right, for both. But these are aspiring influencers, right? They go to on a holiday to Thailand, and how, there's like pictures being taken of them and posted on their Instagrams. Well, it's usually their boyfriends who are taking those pictures, right? Because, everything has to be sort of displayed in public. Nothing can just be experienced in real time. Think of it, any concert you go to, right? Any, tourist attraction or, natural phenomenon you go to, what's the first thing you kind of notice if you look around? Everybody has their phones out and everybody's taking pictures of it, right? So that they can, remember this thing long into the future, even though, almost certainly no one will go back and really scroll through a lot of those moments. Mine is always like people who have the GoPro when they go skiing or something. And I'm like, are you going to rewatch that video of you skiing on January 9th, 2024? Like, is that something you're just going to go back to? Why do we need to record everything? Anyway, right? It's the sense of everything has to be recorded, and it takes you out of the moment because you're always thinking about, how do I make this part of my brand, right? And again, I think I mentioned when we talked about work, the number one job that teenagers want today is influencer. That means putting your whole life on social media. And I mean, you see it on TikTok, right? If I were to watch TikTok, which I do not, but YouTube Shorts automatically opens when I open the YouTube app now, and it's very annoying, and I have to look up if there's a way for me to disable that. Oh, I have to do that so badly. On my phone? Oh, on Chrome. Yeah. No, I must do this because it's very well, I mean, what I find is I open it and then I like lose 20 minutes. I'm like, why am I looking at these things? Well, one of the things you see is people taking videos of their life, right? Or people, oh my God, it drives me crazy. People like teasing their girlfriend and recording it. And I'm like, this has to be fake because you have your phone out. So they must know that this is all a big joke. Anyway, but right, it's part of creating your influencer brand. Okay. So what does this mean, right? You're spending more time online. You're trying always to make experiences online experiences, so you're never really in the moment. And yeah, what do we see? Sharp decline in time spent with friends after 2011. So life increasingly moves online. And like we said, when we started the course, there are some distinct advantages to this for Gen Z, right? They get injured less, right? They don't smoke and drink or have sex at nearly the same rates. Because fundamentally, when you're sitting alone, you can't really do any of the, well, I mean, you could smoke and drink, but it's boring to do it alone. So, you don't do those things as much. So they're safer, right? Teen pregnancy rates are down. There are some good things about it. But it means less experiences, and they're growing up much slower. Okay, phones also blunt what psychologists will call attunement, right? Which is you being attuned to your social environment and learning, from your environment. So things like parents are more distracted, right? One of the top complaints that kids have about their parents is that their parents are on their phones too much. And look, we all know this. I guarantee you, we talk about this. The damn things are so addictive, it's hard to put them down. Less synchronous time with friends and peers, and doing things together, right? Dancing together, singing the same songs, right? Doing things, as groups, right? There's less of that because you're together less. I mean, even like when my 14-year-old has her friends over, they all sit around upstairs and, show each other memes on their phones. It's the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen, but it's what they do. And fewer common experiences like rituals, right? And again, we talked about mediating institutions, right, last time. As people have tuned out of things like religion, social clubs, right, there's less of those all political parties, all of that stuff. There's less rituals that people go through together. So there's a loss of what Durkheim might call collective effervescence, right? There's less of that sort of, collective consciousness being generated and more of that, atomization of people, which is bad. Atomization leads to, did I hear someone whisper the word? Anomie. It leads to anomie, okay, according to Durkheim. Okay, so how does social media potentially mess with development in other ways, right? How does it maybe rewire or hack our kind of brains? Okay, so one of the things that, actually here, let me ask you a question. Maybe I'll ask a very quick question. Oh, works better if I have a picture. My 11-year-old son, if you were to guess who his favorite social media influencer is, what would your guess be? He's 11.
Some video game streamer or something.
Okay.
Specifically a Minecraft YouTuber.
He's moved on slightly from Minecraft. Okay, but you're on. He's now on Fortnite, right? Because I let him get Fortnite, which was a tragic mistake on my part. Though I will say it is. I think I'm the only dad who plays Fortnite with their kid, which is hilarious because sometimes I'm in a party with my 11-year-old and two of his friends, and it's the most hilarious thing in the universe. I like just hearing them talk. It's honestly, I think I understand Chinese better. And I don't speak a word of Chinese. I'll say that, or Mandarin, or Cantonese. It's a whole different language. Anyway, okay. So yeah, it's between Mr. Beast. Now he wants me to buy all the stupid Mr. Beast chocolates every time I go to the store. The Feastables. He's like, "Did you get me Feastables?" I'm like, "Dude, no." Like $4. Can't buy you 2 a day. And yeah, it's I can't remember. I can see his silly face in my head. But yeah, it's a Fortnite influencer. Okay, now why? Well, basically, what Haidt will say is that it comes down, in a sense, to two mechanisms that are sort of co-evolved, right? They're sort of biological cultural strategies that have evolved in human cultures, right? And he calls these conformist bias, and he takes this from Rob Boyd and Pete Richardson, who are both geneticists. But he calls conformist bias and prestige bias, right? So conformist bias, really easy. And again, I think we've talked about this a little bit. We want to fit into the group, so we do what other people do, right? And I mean, okay, so this is why, when you hear about horrible things that happened in the past, right? Let's say the Nazis, right? Why did otherwise well-meaning, kind, generous people become Nazis or support the Nazi regime, right? Well, it was all about this, or the communists in the Soviet Union or whatever. or Donald Trump even. I don't want. Maybe I shouldn't put Donald Trump in with the Nazis. That's a little bit harsh, or not harsh enough. Orange Hitler? No, too far. Okay. I'm kidding. He's not Hitler. He's not focused enough to be Hitler. I'm going to put it that way. All right. So conformist bias, right? Why do people do horrible things? Why does a mob mentality take over and people will, burn the witch or whatever it happens to be? It all comes down to this, right? Conformist bias. We want to fit into the group, so we do what others do. Now for height, this gets kind of broken by social media in one major way, right? Social media offers I crossed off what I was trying to underline. A rapid fire dose of what everyone else is doing, right? So it's really easy to kind of jump on bandwagons because social media offers us just a ton of information about what other people are doing. Now the other one is what's called prestige bias. So, this is where, if you went back to virtually any human civilization, right? You go back to the Romans, right? Or the Greeks, or beyond, right? There was always people who were really good at certain things, right? The best warrior, right? The best fighter, the best general. And all of these people end up having retinues, right? People who want to be around them and emulate them because human beings fundamentally want to associate with the best models we have, right? So, this is why when I was a kid, right, what was up, and again, way back in the 1990s, the prehistoric era, who did I want to be like? I had posters of Mario Lemieux and Jaromir Jagr on my wall, and I had dreams of being in the NHL despite lacking all physical acuity, talent, and ability to play sports, plus having chronic asthma. But, right, I wanted to be, like these people. Why? Because they were the best at what they did, right? They were the best hockey players in the world. Human beings want to associate with the best models we have. Now, why does my son like Mr. Beast and these silly YouTubers? I think I told him, he didn't take this well, people with an IQ that could roughly be measured as equivalent to room temperature. Maybe they're very smart. Mr. Beast actually seems pretty smart. Like he understands the algorithm. And I was room temperature in Fahrenheit. We'll be generous. But why does he want to be like these people? Well, because he sees on social media a bunch of things. He sees how many likes they have. Honestly, oh my God. Just the other day, he comes running into the room in like what sounds like a panic. And he's like, Dad, 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 Dad. I'm like, what? What's on fire? He's like, Mr. Beast passed T-Series. And I'm like, those all sound like words. What do they mean? Right? And he's like, because T-Series was apparently like an Indian YouTuber that makes music, had more followers than Mr. Beast. And Mr. Beast now passed T-Series with like, I want to say 300 million YouTube followers. So, right? And this was like big news. Like, Mr. Beast passed T-Series. I'm like, I think that's English, but what does it mean? Right? Likes, right? Views, right? Oh my gosh, I get to my 11-year-old is like a font of useful information. What did he tell me? He's like, Dad, Mr. Beast just put out this video an hour ago and it already has 40,000 views. I'm like, cool. I don't care, but that's nice. But right, social media tells him through likes and views, and right, even in kind of social status groups, right? This is why at one point I think Instagram had to nerf the like function because it was too powerful in showing girls who was really popular and who wasn't, because all the popular girls had lots of likes on their Instagram and the less popular girls didn't. They can still see it, but other people can't, so you can't do the social comparison. Because social media gives you this like fire hose of information about who's the most popular, who's doing the best. And it leads to people wanting to copy those people. I think Oh, this guy was in the documentary. He was Sean Parker formerly from Facebook, right? And this quote was actually from that documentary because you heard it, right? So one of the early leaders at Facebook, the goal, right? So one of the goals of Facebook and Instagram's founder was to create social validation loops. Exactly the kind of thing a hacker like him would think of because you're exploiting a vulnerability in human psychology, right? You get people, like my dear sweet 11-year-old, to really worship people on social media by pushing, likes, views as the metric of popularity. It creates a social validation loop, right? And according to Haidt, it's been disastrous for young people's social development because, one particular thing. So, I'm going to try to, in the end of the course, bring together almost everything. The most sensitive period for social learning, right, and where these two biases, prestige bias and conformist bias, really, really play a huge role and are really powerful, is between the ages of 9 and 15. I guess I'll say one more thing about conformist bias. We tend to think of, if you ever think of teenagers as rebellious, you're wrong, right? This kind of myth that teenagers are rebellious, they're not. Teenagers are ruthless conformists, right? Just go into a high school. I mean, you actually were in high school more recently than I was. So, deviance, right? Any kind of deviance from whatever social norms are is ruthlessly punished in friend groups, right? You don't like the same music, you don't dress the same way, you look a little different, your interests are a little off, right? If you're that kid that likes, I think anime is cool now. It wasn't when I was growing up, but I liked anime, so no one liked me. I was okay. I turned out fine, right? But yeah, it's a really sensitive period for conformist bias, right? Teenagers are ruthless conformists. So that and prestige bias are really powerful when people are young and impressionable, 9 to 15, right? Now, what happens, and why might this be fundamentally bad from Haidt's perspective? Well, let's put it this way. What are the odds of my 11-year-old son meeting and being mentored by Mr. Beast, right? Because now he wants to be a YouTuber. Lawyer would be better, or doctor, or plumber, or garbage man. Anything other than an influencer. What are the odds? What do you think? How likely is my son to meet Mr. Beast and have Mr. Beast become his mentor and guide him, to a successful career? You're making the 0 sign. Yeah, that's pretty much right. Yep. So this is a problem though, right? Because one of the things remember, we were talking about this, we talked about religion, right? And we talked about mental health. One of the things that young people need is what? Mentors, right? Yeah, caring adults, right? Those caring adults, remember those numbers for stress, isolation, and all that? So why would Mr. Beast not be a good model? Well, it's not that Mr. Beast is not a good guy. Jimmy seems great. Gives a lot of money to charity, builds wells in third world countries, right? I think he got an eye transplant for some kid. I don't know. Seems like a really nice guy. He's not available, right? My son can't build a relationship with Mr. Beast. And all of the time he spends, sort of at the font of Mr. Beast or ridiculous room temperature IQ Fortnite guy, is time that he's not spending building real world relationships with people who could be his mentors, right? All right, and yeah, I mean, in this period, 9 to 15, when people are, worshiping at the altar of people like these influencers, identity, selfhood, emotions, relationships are all developing. They're really important, and in this online environment, they're all going to be different than they would be otherwise. How am I doing for time? Can I repeat the definition of atomization? Yeah, sure. So atomization, is basically where people, instead of, how to put this? Hang on, let me think. So where people basically become like atoms, right? You become individualized and isolated within societies, right? So rather than being, in, communion with other people, you're just one little atom, right? Like this one little unit within society, isolated from everyone else. Think about, I'm in chemical terms and I was always bad at chemistry, but right, atomization is when everybody becomes hydrogen, right? Hydrogen is that single atom, right? So everything's hydrogen, and you have no more kind of complex atoms around because everyone is isolated. They're by themselves. They're one and only. That's atomization, right? Okay. Hopefully that answers that question. Tell me if it didn't. Okay. So I know. There's a lot of text on these slides, so I made them very boring. They're very white and black. I promise. There's graphs coming. So. One of the other things that Haidt talks about in terms of social media is two kind of different modes of being, right? One is discovery mode or discover mode, and the other one is defend mode. And what Haidt will suggest is that these are both sort of normal parts of human psychology and behavior. Because human beings, evolved, in the natural environment in periods of abundance and periods of scarcity that required different behavioral tactics to survive as a species, right? So we have these psychological adaptations that help us to thrive in both abundance and in scarcity. So what's called the behavioral activation system, discover mode turns on when you detect opportunity, right? So, evolutionarily, when your tribe wandered upon an apple grove, and there was all sorts of food to eat, right? You moved into discovery mode because suddenly you were like, oh, there's an opportunity here. We should explore. We should be free. We should eat, right? All of these sorts of things. And this is true, right? When we feel safe, when we feel at ease, when we feel opportunities, we're in a kind of open mode, one that, you're able to experience the world and get a whole bunch of experiences. However, behavioral inhibition mode or defend mode turns on when you detect threats, right? So, people with chronic anxiety, and that's a growing number of you. Sorry, I only speak statistics. Gen Z, lots of anxiety. That's why Haidt calls you the anxious generation. Are constantly in defend mode, right? Always looking for threats, right? This is why, chronic anxiety will lead into things like OCD often, right? Because it's like your brain is constantly looking for threats, even when threats aren't actually there, right? So it's like, if you've ever met someone with, who has really bad OCD, right? They're looking for bugs, right? All the time. Even in the middle of winter, they're worried there might be bugs in the house. Or, they're worried about, if they don't do X, right? If they don't check the back door 15 times before they leave the house, someone might break in and take their most cherished possessions, right? Because they kind of get stuck in defend mode. So yeah, in humans and animals, those in discover mode, as a default, tend to be happier, more sociable, and more eager for new experiences. These are the golden retrievers of the universe, right? Happy, kind of open to new experiences, and all these sorts of things. Those constantly in defend mode are more anxious and defensive. Now, do I have this on the next slide? One of the big problems for Haidt is that when you're constantly thinking, right, and going back to this idea that social media tends to kind of acclimatize people to worrying about how they're going to be perceived all the time, it tends to put people chronically, for him, in defend mode, or more people. So people are going to be more anxious and more defensive because they feel like they're constantly being judged. I got, how many more? Oh, okay. And a few more slides before I've got my big break. How are you all doing? I know we started with like a 35, 40 minutes of video. So are you needing a break, or should I just push through as far as I can get and then let you go a little early today? That one? Okay, let's do that. All right. So, anti-fragility. Oh, hang on. I just want to make sure I got everything. Okay, anti-fragility. So, according to Haidt, when we think about children, typically, oops. Interesting. That can't be good. All right. So, according to Haidt, right, kids are anti-fragile, right? Which means, like, as a default, kids are good at experiencing lots of things, but they're generally kind of resilient to most of the shocks of life, right? Generally, kids recover from things. They recover from falls, from emotional hurts, from parental deaths, all sorts of things. Kids are generally pretty resilient, right? They actually have to be. Otherwise, if every little trauma broke human children, the species never would have made it, out of its beginning evolutionary stages. It would have been, one of these failed evolutionary lines. Now, what Haidt will say, they need play, and human beings fundamentally need risk to grow. And you see this in kind of normal human development. What happens when kids reach like 10, 9, 10, is they go, it's like a switch gets kind of flicked in their brain. And it's honestly interesting to watch. And again, when you've read a bunch of literature, you kind of start to see things in a different way. They want to take a lot more risks, right? They want to do things. They want to go fast, right? They want to go high. They want to do things that are really risky, fun, dangerous, fast moving. Like when my kids were really young, right? My in-laws, who are fabulously wealthy, not that they share it or upgrade their house, but they have lots of money, right? And they have a lake house in Kelowna. And one of the things when my kids were little, going on the tubes right behind their great big powerboat was something that they kind of wanted to do, but they didn't want to go too fast. And the second they hit 9 years old, it was like louder, faster, harder, right? Just like they wanted to be whipped around on that tube going over the biggest waves they could, because something kind of clicks in at about 9 years old, 10 years old, between 8 and 10, where it's like, we need risk. It's like the brain is like, I need to experience things, I need to learn about the world, and I need all sorts of fun, fast, interesting stuff. That's the point where they start to climb really high in trees, right? Or, do really risky things, especially boys, but girls too. Okay, now what Haidt says, and this is 100% true, is that a lot of the risk in childhood was stripped out somewhere in the late 80s and in the 1990s. There was a really weird kind of cultural moment, because all of a sudden people got caught up in all sorts of moral panics and started to really deeply worry about the fact that their kids would get hurt. And especially there was this weird fear that kind of emerged about, children being kidnapped and all of this kind of stuff. And a growing, what we would call, I don't know if I have the word here, safetyism is what Haidt calls it, safetyism. Where basically, I don't know, you're all too young to remember this. Sorry, I remember this very clearly. Parks, when I was a kid, right, in the 1980s and 1990s, were awesome. There was high stuff, right? There were twirly slides made out of metal, and you went down those things at about 800 miles an hour. You could climb around, the edges of them and fall off, which is where I broke my leg. I got a concussion too doing that, because in the middle of winter, I was climbing on the edge of the metal twirly slide. The thing was like, super high. And I fell and hit my head and got a concussion. It was awesome. I loved it. Still have a scar. Like 6 stitches that time, I think. It was pretty good, just bleeding everywhere. I remember my dad coming into the office at school, and it's just like blood all over me. And he's like, hospital, huh? I was like, yeah, it's great. 6 stitches, pretty awesome. But what happens in the 1990s, right, is there's this real move about child safety, and everything gets really boring. And you go from those super fun parks that had like minimal safety features to this shit. Now, what Haidt will say is this park is super fun if you're 4. It gets super boring when you hit about 8 or 9, right? Because there's really not that much you can do that's exciting at these parks, right? So you get kids climbing up on here, right? That's fun for a little while, but mostly this park is like super boring. And trust me when I say, we're in this circumstance. I have a 4-year-old, I have an 11-year-old, I have a 14-year-old. I can't get the 14-year-old to do anything. But like going to a playground with my 4 and my 11-year-old is an interesting experience, because the 4-year-old is having a blast and the 11-year-old is bored to tears because there's really nothing to do in a playground like this if you're 11 years old, right? Whereas, yeah, please.
Well, I was just remembering, as you mentioned, climbing on top of that. I remember at my school, we used to get in trouble when we would do that. We would climb on top of those things. And usually, like, get off, you're being a bad influence.
It's not safe, right? Someone could get hurt. What could happen? You could fall off and get a concussion and, still end up a professor at the U of A, so whatever. It's all good. The brain damage wasn't that bad. I only lost 3 or 4 IQ points. I had 3 or 4 to spare, right? Maybe not. Okay, so you get this kind of move, and Haidt calls it safetyism, right? But basically, along with, I talked about this earlier in the class, right? The middle class and the upper classes moved into a mode of parenting, and it came out in all of the parenting books at the time, right? A mode of essentially what was called concerted cultivation, where parents were sort of in charge of their kids' lives almost constantly, right? So you were putting your kids in, instead of your kids coming home after school, you were putting them in out of school care. You were very closely monitoring them, right? You were the helicopter parent or the Lululemon, right? Keeping an eye on them. They were enrolled in constant activities, right? Overscheduled out the side of their head and all sorts of things, right? So parenting moved into this mode of cultivating your children, giving them very little free time and away from a sort of free play, right? Or what's called the opposite of concerted cultivation is what's called natural growth. I know, it looks weird on the playground, but there it is. That's an H. Natural growth. Okay, so what did natural growth kind of look like at the end of the day? Well, a lot of that was, bands of kids roaming around the neighborhood, mixed age groups of kids roaming around the neighborhood, inventing games, getting into trouble or not, right? And basically wandering far afield. And that was kind of more typical prior to the late 80s, early 1990s. And all of that changes with the growth of safetyism, right? Okay, so the difference between, I guess, the world before and the world now, one of the things that kind of weirdly happened, especially once screens kind of entered this mix, is parents started to think of screens as low-risk environments compared to the real world. And so they were happy to let their kids exist a lot on screens, right? So to play video games online, right, was safer than, being out in the world and maybe you would get kidnapped by, a random stranger on the street. Even though statistically speaking, that's not how kidnapping works. People are immune to statistics. So we went from a world where people had a lot of in real life, in-person experiences to one where, kids were home a lot of the time, managed a lot of the time, supervised a lot of the time, and not kind of exploring the world. And so, we ended up in a world where, one of the experiences a lot of young people have, and while it's fun to play with my 11-year-old, I'm always a little nervous about what he's not getting while he's on a screen. Fortnite, say, comes with very little actual risk. Right? I get shot in the head a lot in Fortnite, and trust me, I never learn anything in particular about being better. I still stand way too still, I still move way too slow, and according to my son, I still walk like I'm an AI. I don't know what that means, but apparently it's bad. So, basically I suck at the game, and I'm okay with that because being good at Fortnite is not a life skill. Now, synchronous play, right, that in real world life, that natural growth had some risks, right? But most of the downside was redressed in real time, especially the social aspects, right? Fights that people would have, arguments. People learned how to navigate social situations in those things in ways that would teach them how to navigate a tough boss or, a spouse or friends later in life that you weren't getting along with. Now, when we get to screen-based life, right, social media errors, on the other hand, can have major downsides compared. All right, here's the thing. I'll tell you a story. A little bit of a story. Because I was reading this book. It's Reclaiming Conversation by Sherry Turkle. It's a really interesting book. Again, if you're looking for fun summer reading lists to make you worry about the state of the world and Gen Z, absolutely read that one too. Really interesting book. And one of the stories she tells in it when it comes to relationships is about, people who are romantically involved and it's technologically mediated. And one particular young man, right, he had been with this girl and most of their fights were had via text messages or on social media. And it was like stuck there forever, right? Basically, every fight they had, she would whip out her phone and be like, well, it's just like what you said on August 15th, 2011, right? We're having the same fight. As compared to, let's say me and my wife. We fight, not often, but we do fight. I don't remember what fight we had in 2011, and I never will because we didn't record any of it, right? In real life has this kind of weird synchronous quality where you forget about a lot of stuff. So things get redressed in the real world. On social media, things can have a permanence, right? If in, the 9th grade, you said something mean to Nancy on Instagram, she might still have it out for you. And she probably has that post saved on Instagram so that just at the right moment, she can get back at you, right? She can crush you like you crushed her, right? Because it has this permanence and she can revisit the whole thing time and time again. Okay, so according to Haidt, I'm actually going to erase something because I want to take it off. I want to take off this line I scribbled. And because I think this is really key, and even so key that I'm going to highlight it. According to Haidt, we've made a sort of critical error, but I want this in green because I think it's important. We offer too much protection in person, where risks are manageable, and too little virtual protection, right? We've tended to give young people virtually free rein on screens and almost no protection in the virtual world and too much protection in the real world. So instead of getting these synchronous experiences they desperately need, they get a lot of online experiences that are of far less value. Okay, so what did this do? Parents being obsessed with safety has not necessarily had a great effect. So he says safety has undergone what he calls, I'm going to color this in, concept creep. Right, and concept creep is where, a concept that has a very clear definition over time will sort of expand its definition into other things, right? So yeah, parents used to fear kidnappers and other abstract threats and added protection to their kids' lives, right? They put them in out of school care so that a bus would come pick them up after school or a van, drive them to the out of school care, make sure that they were taken care of and they had no time that was unsupervised until their parents picked them up and then took them to karate or whatever, or hockey or whatever it happened to be. So they took a lot of those risks out. So that used to be how they went. But now a lot of non-threatening things are seen as dangerous by young people. And Haidt particularly sort of talks about this in terms of the change in campus culture that he noticed, right? And Haidt, he's got to be in his late 50s now. Or he's really stressed out from his research because he looks a bit older. One of the things that he says is, compared to the millennials, I think we talked about this at the beginning of the course, right? Millennials had this sort of optimistic, bubbly openness to new ideas. And when Gen Z arrived on campus, Gen Z, and again, this is not a knock and this is not a moral judgment, Gen Z was worried about a lot of things, and a lot of things that Gen Z worried about were things like words or ideas causing harm, right? Whereas in the millennial era, a guest speaker, from the right or whatever would have basically issued a sort of shrug and a few people would have gone and it mostly would have been ignored. Today, right, Gen Z feels that those people threaten their safety, right? That basically people with ideas that they don't agree with are somehow threatening to their safety. Okay, so according to Pew Research, this is really interesting. And just to say how safety-ish people have gotten. And I think some of these are ridiculous, although, based on, I think some of the answers some of you gave earlier in the course, this was some of you. Parents on average say kids should be 10 before being allowed to play alone in the front yard. I need to circle that because it's ridiculous. In the front yard, right? So kids need to be 10 before they can be allowed to play alone in the front yard, like literally 4 feet from your house. Your kid needs to be 10 years old, says the average American parent. These people are insane. 12 before they can be left at home alone for 1 hour. One, not like overnight, not, you're going out for dinner, 1 hour. They need to be 12 before they can be left at home alone for 1 hour. I'm going to put a big win for me because I've definitely left my younger than 12-year-old kids alone at home for more than 1 hour. And they were fine. They made themselves some pizza pops. They played video games. They watched TV. They were okay. And this one just absolutely knocks my socks off. 14 before they can go alone to a public park. Now, maybe my parents were uniquely irresponsible, but I went to the public park by myself when I was 6. And so the idea, and I'm still alive, I think, unless this is hell. No, I'm still alive. It is hot in here, so it could be hell. But aside from that, no, but this is the kind of safety creep, right? And this, if for Gen Z, this would have been unimaginable. Or sorry, not Gen Z, Gen X. I mean Gen X. Why? We need a better name. We need to start calling them Zoomers or something. For Gen X, this would have been unimaginable, right? Gen X was experiencing all of these things way before any of these ages. So there's been a creep of the sense of safety, right? You can't leave people, your kids alone. You can't let them play in the front yard. And the funny thing is, and Haidt talks about this, and you certainly hear stories about this, this is not just like parents, but actually, this is community members. Because there have been cases where, say, a 6-year-old or a 5-year-old was playing alone in the front yard, and people will call Child Protective Services on the parents to be like, hey, there's a kid out on the sidewalk alone without a parent, or who took their dog for a walk alone, and people have called Child Protective Services on parents. Jamie, you're giving me this like, oh my God. Yeah, but this is the degree to which safetyism has creeped in. Okay. How does kidnapping work, statistically speaking? Okay, I mean, almost inevitably, like stranger kidnapping is incredibly rare. Honestly, you're most likely to be kidnapped by a family member. The most common form of kidnapping is, when parents are divorced, one parent kidnaps the child because they've been cut out of custody. That's like number one. Uncles, aunts, right, other relatives are the other top kidnappers. But like strangers driving up to you in a white van offering you candy or a puppy doesn't even make the list, right? Like this is, there are certainly cases where this has happened, but they're so statistically insignificant that it's not the trend. Yeah.
I will also add that when something like that does go down, it usually makes the news. Like literally yesterday, there was an attempt by 2 women to basically do that, show up at the van and tell the kid to get in, and it was an attempt because kid got away. Like he realized that he was in danger and walked away.
Yeah, most kids aren't going to get into a van with a stranger, right? It's just like
so even just the attempt, not even that it actually like he didn't get kidnapped. The attempt itself is what made the news.
Right.
And people literally kids get kidnapped in divorce proceedings all the time. And it like barely makes the news unless like the parents are like on this grand spree or like have crazy early charges.
Yeah, I mean, you'll get most of the Amber Alerts, like almost all the Amber Alerts that you see, it's a parent, right? It's dad didn't return the kid after a weekend, and it's almost always dad. And now they're like, oh shit, like, sorry, bad language. Dad didn't show up to drop off the kid. We think dad might be on the run, right? So everybody look for dad's, gold SUV or whatever. Like almost inevitably, that's what Amber Alerts are. It's almost like is so statistically infrequent that it's like a complete stranger kidnapped. Like I said, it does happen. There was the case in the 80s in Edmonton of Corrine Punky Gustafson who just disappeared off the street. But it's really statistically rare. But those cases make the news. Yeah, getting kidnapped by your dad doesn't as much. Yeah, please. So sex trafficking is a little bit different. And it does happen. It's still relatively rare, right? As like compared to being kidnapped by your parent, it's still relatively rare that you're going to end up being sex trafficked. Tends to happen a little bit later as well. Average age is somewhere between 12 and 15 for sex trafficking. But again, it's a very particular. Okay, it's very particular, and it's very. If you look at who gets trafficked for the most part, it's street involved, youth for the most part. Immigrants, right? People who are migrants get trafficked a lot. Like if you were to look at in Europe right now, I think it's like probably 70% of them are Ukrainian in terms of people who are being trafficked because they've had to flee, right? And they, fall into the hands of ruthless people. Latin Americans in the U.S. are the number one victims of trafficking, as are people from East Asia. So there are really particular profiles, and it tends to go along with not like you were kidnapped off the street in order to be trafficked. That's pretty rare. Occasionally, there will be these cases like happened in Edmonton. Was it a year or two ago? Where basically it was a 13-year-old girl. She met someone online. He picked her up at school, and then they made a beeline for the U.S. border. And I think by the time they figured out what happened, he'd already basically gotten across. But yeah, anyway, it did not. There were some very traumatic conversations with my then, I think she was 12 at the time, year old daughter. I'm like, never talk to anyone online. Everyone online wants to kill you. See what happened to this girl? Don't be that girl. But it's very statistically rare. And again, most human trafficking, migrants, street involved, people in fairly extreme poverty, drug users, right? That's most common when we talk about trafficking. But it's not like, it happens, but it's not super common that, say, someone from a middle-class family all of a sudden falls into human trafficking. Or they get picked up at the mall. It happens, but statistically speaking, that's not the bulk of people who get trafficked. Sorry, does that answer your question? Oh, parents are insane. I mean, like, I think your odds of going to the playground and being picked up and ending up in like Guadalajara, are not overly huge. Again, with like, somehow you ended up, doing crack in Tijuana. Just not the typical thing. There are really specific patterns to who gets trafficked, right? And it tends to be people who are quite vulnerable already because they don't have a way out, right? And again, there's grooming. Pedophiles will groom you. I had this conversation with one of your classmates who apparently they kept trying to be groomed. For some reason, people were like, I'm going to groom that person. It was weird. Anyway, it's just like online. It's like, hey, I'm playing Roblox. Would you like to be trafficked now? But there's weird things. Like people do that. But again, statistically speaking, most people who are subject of human trafficking come from very specific groups. So anyway, yeah, but no, you're not going to. Chances are if you let your 14-year-old go to the playground by themselves, you're not going to find them 20 years later, in a Moscow brothel. It's just not how it's going to go. So, all right, it's really hot in here. It's 3 o'clock. Okay, how am I doing for time? I'm doing so terrible. All right, puberty. Oh, puberty. Puberty. So, puberty, obviously a time of intense physical change for human children, especially in the brain. And height, basically says it's a period where young people need to experience a lot of useful things to develop helpful behavioral patterns. Socially, physically, right, people need a lot of experiences. And what he'll say is safetyism, right? Crazy parents won't let their 14-year-old go down the block because their parents are like, no, you'll get human trafficked and you'll end up, as a prostitute in Toronto. Or something. That kind of safetyism and smartphones block the experiences young people need. All right, and he outlines 4 foundational harms caused by technology. So we'll go through each of these in turn, but social deprivation, sleep deprivation, attention fragmentation, and addiction. And the addiction one is actually kind of wild because until I read this, I never cued in on certain things. I'll tell you about some of them because they're really, really interesting. It suggests, here is where I'll say something controversial. It's clear to me that psychology as a discipline never should have been explored because we now know way too much about how the human mind works and it's super easy to exploit people. So, it's just like the fact that we now really understand how human beings' brains and minds function is clearly, one of the great tragedies of history, and you should all storm the psychology department with torches and pitchforks and burn it to the ground. Kidding, somewhat. Okay, so social media harms, and we'll talk about this if we have time today. If not, we'll definitely talk about it next time. Social media tends to harm girls more than boys, but boys face their own unique set of issues, video games and porn being the two big ones. Okay, so what is social media? 4 features of social media. So user profiles, right? So you have a specific profile, right? And it's got a picture of you. I don't know what my arm's doing there. And you are the one, so it has a picture of you, it's connected to you, it has a name that somehow represents you. Oops, I have a typo there. User-generated content, right? So you are the one generating content for the social media platform. They're generally networked, right? So it's you connecting with other people. There's interactivity. And there's interactivity, right? So you are communicating with people through these networks, right? So whether it's you on YouTube or Facebook or Instagram, right? There are all of these sorts of things. That's what social media looks like. It used to be about connecting people, but sometime in 2010 and completed by 2015, the character of social media went from, say the original goal of Facebook, right? So we think of Facebook as you connecting with all of those people you went to high school with or junior high or elementary school. And that's what social networking and social media used to be about, right? Connecting people, and you could see updates from, I remember when I got on Facebook at first, a bunch of people that I went to, it was kind of at the beginning of it, because I'm old. Everybody was adding like their friends from elementary school, and a bunch of people that I hadn't seen in 20 years added me on Facebook just to see what I was up to, right? That used to be what social media was. But as of, between 2010 and 2015, the business model changed, and it became about, keeping about that attention farm, right? Or keeping your attention and maximizing the amount of time you spent on these particular platforms, right? So it's maximizing time and always with the purpose of selling ads, right? Selling ads, right? And again, that's what that whole kind of documentary is about, getting a better and better understanding of who you are and what you do so it can keep you engaged, feed you content you like, and sell you more ads. Okay, so harm 1, according to Haidt, of social media is social deprivation, right? So phones, social media, initially were pitched as connecting us, but increasingly what they actually do is create social disconnection, right? And so again, we've seen this chart before. It was on those slides from last time, and it's here again, right? Back in that magical golden age of 2003, right around here. Young people spent almost, 2.5 to 3 hours a day with each other. And it's been declining ever since. And its sharpest decline, it declined here, but then its sharpest declines, are right in here. And again, that's before COVID. Now, so increasing disconnection, right? And you get this whole thing. Young people are lonelier today, right? More connections, right? Let's say, and we'll talk about this again as we go through, quantity is way up, right? How many Facebook friends do you have? Or how many, followers on Instagram? Lots, right? It used to be the joke. I remember, seeing people, they had like 600 Facebook friends. And because I am a weird person, I had a rule. And I still have this rule. I can never have more than 30 Facebook friends. If I have 30, I have to take some off. And so I have to go through this process of being like, who haven't I talked to in the last 1.5 or 2 years? Because that person has to die. I mean, they have to die from my Facebook, right? I don't even use Facebook. I have to access it on the computer because I took it off my phone because it was dumb and it taking up space that could better be used for other things. But most people, right, 300 Facebook friends, how many people do they talk to? So you have quantity, but ultimately declining quality, right? Fewer close friendships. Quality's down. Okay, less time spent together, more on screen. Far less embodied time, so far less quality time with those few people that are really, really close to you. And I think, this question was asked last time, okay, well, what about, people who have left traditional communities and jumped on socials? What is that? Has that kind of replaced it? And it's like, yeah, there's a lot more quantity, right? You may know 1,000 people on Reddit, that hive of scum and villainy. But the quality of those relationships is never going to be the same as, the people you spent all of that time with back in 2003. Okay, so far less embodied time. And yeah, this, even when you're together, people are elsewhere, right? That's the alone together thing from Sherry Turkle that I keep referencing. Okay, so that's social deprivation. Less time together with people, right? And that's where you build those really close friendships, right? Is in spending a ton of time with people. Okay, sleep deprivation. And I know I talked about this already, and someone laughed because they were like, 9 hours, I get like 3 hours of sleep a night. It's because you're playing too much Fortnite. Stop it. Okay, so teens need, on average, right, 9 hours or more of sleep per night, right? Now, why? Well, I mean, this is developmental, right? The teenage brain is undergoing just tremendous, Teenagers and babies need a lot of sleep because teenagers and babies are both in this kind of period where their brains are developing super rapidly, right? Obviously, babies are getting used to the world, and teenagers are also getting used to the world, just in different ways, right? They're transitioning from a childhood brain to an adult brain, and that takes a lot of energy, and the brain needs a lot of rest. So on average, right, if you were to talk ideal numbers, kind of between about 11 and probably about 25, you should be getting 9 or more hours of sleep per night. And you're like, no, that's not happening. But it should, right? And again, think about this in evolutionary terms, right? When human beings were, in the forests of Northern Europe or, the plains of Africa, the sun went down, it was really dark. That's when all the dangerous predators come around. So you get in your tent or your cave or wherever you're living around the fire and you sleep, right? With a few people on guard. Sun went down, you go to sleep. Now we have electric lights and Netflix, so we can stay up till 2 a.m, binge watching shows that probably aren't worth watching. But, that's certainly not The Acolyte, but anything else, I suppose. I watched the first episode of The Acolyte. I was not very happy. Star Wars, you hurt me so. All right. So, yeah, 36 correlational studies found a connection between high social media use and poor sleep. Right, but I mean, just look at this chart, right? So 1991, and again, 2003, that's me, roughly there. Teens who get less than 7 hours of sleep a night, so that's 2 hours less than optimal, right? It's been increasing, and then it takes a big jump right here, kind of as we hit that social media, smartphone kind of nexus, right? Heavy social media use is linked to poor sleep duration. And a 2020 study found that greater sleep disturbance, shorter total sleep times were associated with greater internalization scores. Okay, what does that mean? Internalizing disorders, right? Depression, anxiety, these sort of like internal emotional states, right? These are just disorders that tend to be problematic because they make you feel sad and not at ease in the world. The less you sleep, the more likely you are to get those and some externalizing scores, right? Including things like aggression. So sleep is really important. Now, again, why would smartphones and social media potentially be the problem? Well, specifically, do I have the numbers? I think I'll talk about this and I'll go back because I want to highlight this number. Heavy social media users like teen girls. How many notifications do they get? So the average person, right? So the average person in terms of notifications is about nearly 200 or about per day, or about 11 per hour. Heavy users like teen girls, the average is 1 notification per minute. Okay, what does that have to do with sleep? Well, where do most of you, if I was going to ask, where do you keep your phones at night? Bedside? On the opposite end of your room. You have it silenced probably on Do Not Disturb. Yeah, a lot of people keep it at their bedside, right? Now, obviously, you're all mature and wonderful, and I'm sure you can manage your social media use. Younger teenagers can't, and right, having these devices in their rooms, ping, 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 someone tags you on Instagram, ping, ping, Noah sent you another text message. Stupid Noah. Sorry, that's my daughter's not boyfriend. He's not my boyfriend. I'm like, well, he texts you a lot. Anyone texted me that much, they'd be my boyfriend. Anyways, sorry. I'm not bitter, but come on, I can see what's right in front of me. I'm not stupid. I have a PhD in sociology. I know how this stuff works. I swear my daughter is going to grow up and be like, man, I hated that my dad had a PhD in sociology, because I was like, this study, I think now she just tells me to shut up. But whatever, right? Your phone next to your bed means less sleep, right? Because it's pinging, especially when you're a teenager and you can't stop, right? You're checking social media to see if anyone liked your picture or whatever. It all affects things, right? And, if you're on, we know, right, despite the yellow filter that nominally turns your screen slightly yellow at night, I'm not convinced it actually does anything. I'm really not convinced it does anything. Basically, right, screens before bed, generally disruptive to sleep. You sleep less, and we see that from those heavy user scores. Okay. Man, there's this cool book. I'm like in the middle of it. I had to stop because I was reading other things talking about smartphones and how they've absolutely screwed up our brains. You should absolutely read it too. I'm going to tell you what the title is. It's called Stolen Focus. Really interesting book about how, this economy that wants your attention all the time has stolen your ability to do things like read a book or sit there quietly with your own thoughts. There's a great scene from Brooklyn Nine-Nine where he's in solitary confinement and he goes in like 2 seconds from being alone to my father never loved me, I'll die alone. And that's, I always think of that when I think about stolen focus. All right, attention fragmentation. All of these devices, right, they're meant to keep your attention. And, they have it a stylized way in that documentary, right, where the second that kid isn't paying attention, the 3 little dudes are like sending notifications designed to re-engage him as much as possible, right? This is, fundamentally, I have all the notifications on any social media apps I have turned off, specifically so I can actually just go to them when I care. I care too much about Twitter. But aside from that, I don't use social media that much. But, right, all of these things are meant to draw your attention all the time, which makes it really, really, really hard to focus on things. I'm sure you've all had this experience where you're trying to focus on some task you really need to do, like study for an exam or write a paper, and you can't because, every 2 seconds you end up on your phone and you don't know how you got there, but you ended up watching 45 minutes of I can see it in your face, of YouTube shorts. Okay. What's that? Or TikTok or Instagram Reels or whatever it happens to be, right? And suddenly you're like, wow, I was supposed to be studying for the last hour. I'm so happy I know about this girl and her dog, which I saw for some reason. Okay. Now, one of the things that my daughter insists on this, and I keep telling her that I can point to the studies that say this isn't true. People will tend to say, I know this was true for younger millennials. They say, well, we're really good at multitasking. And I can tell you 100%, the literature is not even ambiguous on this. You're not very good at multitasking. Multitasking in human brains doesn't exist. Human brains can't do 2 things at once. You can do things, basically it's like this. You do tasks in really rapid succession, right? And you switch tasks a lot. However, every time you switch tasks, your performance suffers. And they've done this in randomized control trials, right? So they take people and they give them an IQ test. And you have a control group where they just, they have no distractions, they just do the IQ test. And they have the other group where they try to do an IQ test, but they get constant notifications on a smartphone. And the difference in terms of performance on IQ tests is somewhere between 10 and 20 points, right? So, I mean, 10 and 20 points is a lot. 10 and 20 points is like the difference between, being gifted and basically, being, someone who will have a hard time holding a job because you're that unable to follow, to follow through and complete tasks, right? It's a lot, like a great job and a really marginal job. That's the difference between, people who are separated by 20 IQ points. But all of those distractions make you worse and worse at tasks you otherwise would be good at. Every time you switch tasks, your performance on those tasks suffer. And lots of studies now are pointing to the fact that heavy smartphone use probably worsens ADHD symptoms. So, bad. Basically, all of you and me and everyone, your smartphone is turning you into Doug, the dog from Up, right? You remember Doug? Every time he thinks he hears a squirrel, he loses focus, and then he comes back and he's like, hi there, because he forgot entirely the conversation you just had. So increasingly, smartphones are turning us all into Doug. Now, I love Doug. I don't want to be Doug. Doug is adorable, and I like him, but I don't want to be him. All right. Now, this is the one that kind of broke my brain, and we'll see how long this takes. But maybe this might be our last one for the day, and we'll end early. Addiction. Now, I don't use this term. I would never throw out the word addiction in a casual way. And one of the things I've always hated is when people talk about things like porn addiction or sex addiction in really casual ways, because I'm not entirely convinced that those things are real. That said, one of the things that, social media is kind of built on is a really clear rewards system, right? And basically, little dopamine bursts, right? It's a very Skinner boxy kind of way of thinking about human psychology. But this is where I say, right, we understand human psychology really, really well in such a way as it's now really, really difficult to it's really easy for people to like hack your brain and really hard for you as a human being not to have your brain hacked. Okay. So what does this look like? All right, so smartphones obviously give us little bursts of dopamine as rewards for certain actions, right? So it starts, and this is actually another interesting book. It's Hooked: How to Make Habit-Forming Products, right? And I mean, the author, Yao warned about the ethical implications of the misuse of this model, but he wrote a book about it and made it super clear how to do it anyway, which, good call. All right, so what do you get? A trigger, right? Something external that kind of pulls you in, right? So this is typically a notification, right? You get a notification on your phone that something is happening on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter or TikTok or whatever. The notification triggers an action, right? So what do? You pick up your phone, you unlock it, you check the notification, you go into the app, right? And there, nothing too insidious there. Where the really insidious part comes is the bottom two steps here. And like I said, I had never really, my pen is not penning. Oh, there it is. I never really realized this. And once I realized it, it honestly made me rethink how insidious things like Rocket League and Fortnite, which I thought were kind of innocuous, actually are. Okay. So what's the variable reward? So variable rewards, right? It's like gambling. So, how to put this? We know a lot about this from animal experiments, especially experiments on rats, right? Is if you give a reward every time an action is done, for a while, a rat, or a human in this case, will repeat that action, right? So if every time, you push on the lever, you get a food pellet, right? The rat is going to do that for a while until it gets bored, right? And then the reward stops becoming rewarding. Or if you if you give people something they want on a notification, you're going to do that a whole bunch of times, but eventually you're probably going to get kind of bored, right? And it's not going to be as rewarding because every time you open it, you get the same thing. A variable reward is kind of weird. And the real principle here, like where you see this, really developed and where social media has actually adapted a lot of it. Come on, show up for me. Slots, right? So, like you go to Vegas or any casino and there's people sitting at the slot machine. And if you've never played the slots, you're like, wow, that looks really, really boring. Why would anyone play the slot machines? Well, the reason people like slot machines and what it does is it gives you a variable reward, right? So at certain intervals, you're going to win, right, on the slot machine. Yeah, a little bit of money, a lot of money, depends. You're not going to win every time you push that button, but that actually makes it more addictive because what happens is your brain is anticipating the reward, right? So it's like that dopamine burst builds up and builds up and builds up. And once you hit 3 cherries or whatever it is on the slot machine, right, and you win $5 even though you put in 600, you get that little burst of dopamine and it feels really, really good because you've been waiting and waiting and waiting for your reward to come, right? And then you got that reward. Now, think about TikTok in the same way, right? When you're like scrolling through a bunch of TikTok videos mindlessly, right? It's like, no, not interested. AI voice talking about crazy facts about history. No. Flick, dog video, don't care. Oh, some, political video featuring that podcaster I really like. Oh, that really hits the spot. And you're going through that same kind of variable reward model with social media, right? It's like, I didn't like that video. I didn't like that video. I didn't like that video. Yeah, now I'm going to spend 30 seconds watching it. Okay, back to it. And you never know when that reward is going to hit. And that's why YouTube Shorts, right? That's why I lose 25 minutes on it or more. That's why, I had to like uninstall YouTube on my daughter's phone and be like, no more shorts. No, bad. You can't. You just lose hours on it because that variable reward is actually pretty addictive, right? And that's what social media does. And Instagram is structured, right? It's like Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, especially TikTok. TikTok is really, really good at this. Why you find TikTok addictive, if you do, is specifically because it's designed to take advantage of this, right? It's going to give things that it knows you don't like and then something you really like at variable intervals, frequently enough to keep you hooked in, but not so frequently that you get it all the time. Is that a question?
I was just going to add, I don't know if you'll take in any of the site names here, in 371, but you learn more about like intermittent reinforcement schedules. It also makes extinction, which is like the deconditioning of that behavior, of that like conditioned behavior, really difficult.
Right.
So even if you get off of it, the moment it's reintroduced, it's like that crap. It starts acting.
Well, your brain remembers, right?
Condition really quickly again. You can do like extinction. There's like a bunch of experiments showing how like extinction just doesn't work on an intermittent schedule. It's very difficult to break.
Yeah, that's why like gambling addictions are so hard to break, right? Behavioral addictions are really hard. Okay, great comment. Psychology, like I said, never should have happened. It broke humanity and will never come back. We're all going to end up like, it's going to be the end of the world. Nuclear bombs are raining down and none of us will notice because we're all on TikTok. That's how it's going to happen. I don't know if that is, but it sounds like the interesting premise for a dystopian novel. All right, the last one here is investment. And this actually, and what Haidt will say is that investment is the one that takes this from like hard to break to really hard to break because you're invested in social media in lots of ways, right? Especially things like Instagram, Snapchat. You've created a profile, you've created an image, right? You've created a sort of avatar for yourself. So you're invested personally in that platform as well, right? Like if you're even Twitter, right? You're participating in, I guess, X now. What a stupid name. I keep calling it Twitter. I'm like, Twitter X. What the hell do I call this platform? Just calling it X sounds really dumb. I understand why Elon did it. It's a business thing, but whatever. All right. So you create a profile and it's hard to quit. Now, I say this is really insidious, right? Now, and I never understood this until Height kind of pointed it out. Things like for boys in video games, Fortnite and Rocket League and anything else also have these sorts of things. Now, I didn't really understand what was happening, right? I have an 11-year-old. He started playing Rocket League and now he's playing Fortnite. And he was always asking me to buy skins, right? Or buy decals for the cars in Rocket League, or buy skins in Fortnite, right? Because he could play as this character. Right now he wants the Mr. Beast one. And I'm like, no. Jonathan Haidt ruined everything for you. You take it out on him. Having those kind of investments, like you have your own personal kind of brand, right? You have your own skin, you have your own back bling in Fortnite, right? The little backpack you wear and a pickaxe and all of these things that you've kind of customized so that your character is different from everybody else's characters creates this investment as well, right? Where it's really, really hard to quit because you're so invested in all the time you've put in, right, to earn V-Bucks or credits in Rocket League, to get that skin, right, get that rank, all of those things. That investment makes it really, really hard to quit. So yeah, like if we're talking about Fortnite, right, so skins and ranks, I know those will show up eventually, maybe, right, a little bit of a lag. Skins and ranks, right, create that investment for boys in some of those video games where it becomes really hard to quit. Something just beeped at me and I don't know what it was. Oh, I know what it was. It's something in my email. Okay. So conclusions for this part. And then I guess maybe because we didn't take a break, I'll let you go after this. But so for Height, right, when we put all of those 4 harms together, we get an explanation as to why youth mental health got so much worse when childhood suddenly became phone-based, right? More monitoring, less safety, less real-world experiences, right? Constantly being put in defend mode rather than discover mode. And then the inability to sort of quit these platforms. So sleep deprivation, right? Social deprivation. What's the third one? Attention fragmentation, right? We've created a sort of magic mix with these technologies where they're really good at holding our attention, but they take things away from us that we might otherwise want. All right, so maybe we'll end 20 minutes early. We'll come back on Wednesday, our last day of class, and we'll talk about 2 subjects: why social media harms girls more than boys, and what the heck is the deal with boys, before very briefly sketching out some of the things that Height thinks might be the solutions to some of these problems. So yeah, we'll leave it there because we didn't take any breaks today. So your break is now. Go get yourself some food and go home. Don't come back. But yeah, we'll kind of go from there, and we'll finish up, and it should be a good time. Yeah.